Now, here's one that's going to start some arguments, and honestly, that's exactly the point. Kurt Cobain. The man is a rock god to millions, and I get it. But on pure technical merit, he was limited. Power chords, heavy fuzz, feedback, and almost zero solos worth mentioning across 3 studio albums. Guitar teachers used to hold up Nirvana tabs as examples of what beginners could master in a single weekend. But here's the thing, Cobain absolutely knew that about himself. The simplicity was a deliberate philosophy rooted entirely in punk's anti-virtuosity tradition. Listen closely to In Bloom and you'll hear real rhythmic sophistication, buried deep under all that noise. He could have played more. He chose not to. And that specific choice helped define an entire generation of rock music. Whether that makes him a genuinely bad guitarist or a secretly brilliant one is honestly a better argument than most bands will ever manage to inspire. Brace yourselves, because The Edge might actually be the most defensible lineage entry on this entire list, and simultaneously the most infuriating, depending entirely on who you ask. The criticism is very familiar. His signature sound lifts inside delay units and echo pedals rather than in any traditional sense of fingerpicking or soloing. Guitar purists have been saying the gear does the real work since around 1981. Strip away the effects, and you've genuinely got some very basic chord shapes underneath, but here's the counter argument. Remove that delay entirely, and the whole song simply collapses. That's not a crutch. That's composition in its purest form. The Edge didn't just use effects, he invented an entire sonic vocabulary that defined arena rock for an entire generation of listeners. Nobody ever complains that a piano comes with hammers. Sometimes the instrument you actually build is far more interesting than the one you originally inherited. The songs don't care either way. Right. Now we're into genuinely dangerous territory, because Noel Gallagher's fan base takes absolutely no prisoners. The critics say he sounds like someone with a few weeks of practice who simply never improved past that. His solos famously described as boring in the worst possible sense of that word. But stop and actually think about what those records contained. Champagne Supernova, Live Forever, Don't Look Back in Anger. Those melodies don't need any pyrotechnics to work on people. Gallagher was always completely serving the song, and in the Britpop era, the song was the entire point. Nobody sat through an Oasis gig desperately waiting for the guitar solo. They were there for that massive chorus, and Noel delivered it every single time without fail. Is he technically a weak guitarist? Probably, honestly, yeah. Did he write the most singable guitar anthems of the entire 90s? Absolutely, without question. Sometimes those two things just live comfortably in the same person. Now this is where the argument gets genuinely philosophically interesting, because Johnny Ramone might be the purest example on this entire list of a real limitation weaponized into a true signature. His technique was, by any classical measure, completely rudimentary. Relentlessly fast, non-stop downstroke power chords with zero variation, zero embellishments, and zero surprises across his entire long career. Guitar teachers worldwide used his playing as the quintessential before picture. But consider this carefully. He played well, over 2,000 documented shows, and never once changed his approach because it was exactly, precisely perfect for what the Ramones actually needed every single night. That thundering mechanical downstroke locked in tightly with the drumming created something almost industrial in its sheer intensity. And maintaining that speed and precision across a full Ramones set night after night for 20 solid years, that is genuinely hard to do. People always forget that important part. Limitations, weaponized correctly, become a permanent legacy. Alright, I'll be completely honest on this one because CC DeVille is the entry where being charitable gets genuinely difficult. Guitar World specifically singled out his live solo work as completely devoid of taste, structure, or steady tempo, and recommended every budding guitarist listen carefully. Because surely nobody could possibly do any worse. That's not a review, that's a full-scale intervention. Now, in his defense, and there is one, his recorded work on Poison's studio albums is campy, fun, and genuinely effective hair metal. Talk dirty to me. Every rose has its thorn. Those records still hold up fine, but the gap between what he put on tape and what occasionally came out of his live amp was genuinely enormous. Some guitarists have off nights. CC seemed to treat the entire concept of on nights as basically optional information. Still kind of love the chaos, honestly. Rock and roll was never supposed to be tidy. Here's one where the worst guitarist label says considerably more about the person making the argument than the guitarist actually being discussed. Neil Young's playing has been called erratic, barely evolved since his Buffalo Springfield days, and my personal absolute favorite description ever, emotionally excessive. His solos are distortion-heavy, sometimes structurally wobbly, and about as far from technically polished as you can possibly get while still receiving a performance fee. But the Godfather of Grunge title didn't just appear from nowhere on its own. Young's feedback-drenched, emotionally raw approach directly influenced Cobain, Thurston Moore, and effectively the entire alternative rock lineage of the late 80s and 90s. The sloppiness isn't the flaw here. It is the feeling itself. There's a reason those solos make the hairs on your arms stand up, especially when they're visibly falling apart. Technically imperfect. Emotionally completely devastating. Some guitarists must choose between those two things. Neil never did.
To Hollywood, I've been to Redwood.
Tom Morello might be the most intellectually interesting entry on this list because the debate around his playing forces you to actually define what guitar playing even is. Critics call him technologically proficient rather than technically proficient. His signatures come from gear manipulation, whammy pedals set in specific ways using an Allen wrench as a fretting tool, running nearly dead batteries through effects units. Sounds like cheating, right? Except Rolling Stone ranked him 18th on their list of the greatest guitarists of all time. And in 2023, he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Morello has pushed back hard on the traditionalist framing, arguing there's a deep conservatism in guitar culture that assumes the instrument must be played the way it always has been, which is a fair point. Rage Against the Machine didn't sound like anyone else. If the gear creates sounds nobody else imagined, maybe that's not a limitation. Maybe that's invention. Steve Jones of the Sex Pistols is the entry that kind of breaks the entire premise of this video, and honestly, he genuinely enjoy knowing that. Loud, messy, built on the same basic chord shapes, recorded in what sounded like deliberate chaos from absolute start to finish. Even his biggest offenders openly admit he never took himself particularly seriously as a musician at any point whatsoever. The Pistols' own lyrics basically said the quiet part out loud. The only notes we care about are the ones that come in wads. But Jones was predominantly a rhythm guitarist in a punk band, and for that specific role, he was genuinely perfect. The real problem is simply the wrong standard being applied here. Measuring Steve Jones against jazz criteria is exactly like judging a kitchen knife by how elegantly it scoops soup, not what the knife is designed for. Pretty vacant. Anarchy in the UK. Messy? Absolutely. Wrong? Completely not. Here's the one where I'm genuinely pushing back on the entire premise, because Mark Tremonti appearing on Worst Guitarist list tells you far more about genre bias than actual playing ability. Yes, he leans on drop D tuning. Yes, the post-grunge chord progressions of Creed got relentlessly mocked throughout the early 2000s. But here's what consistently gets ignored. Tremonti is widely regarded within serious hard rock circles as genuinely technically proficient with legitimate, demonstrable chops. Criticism almost always comes from people who dislike the genre and are simply disguising that personal preference as a technical argument about guitar playing ability. Alter Bridge exists precisely because Tremonti wanted to demonstrate what he could actually do outside the Creed context, and the results were genuinely impressive by any honest measure. This is your reminder that I don't like this band, and this guitarist genuinely cannot play are two entirely different sentences. Not every guitarist on a worst list actually belongs there. And finally, I saved him for last deliberately, Lil Wayne. When his rock album Rebirth dropped in 2010, the response was immediate and nearly universal. The guitars were sloppily played, the live solos notoriously chaotic, the whole enterprise driven by what reviewers called a misguided belief he needed guitars to enter rock canon. All of that is technically accurate, but consider the full context carefully. Wayne had just released the Carter III, one of the very few albums to go platinum in its first week. He was on every radio station simultaneously. He could have done literally anything with that momentum. And instead, he made a rock album anyway, knowing exactly what the response would be before a single note was recorded. One writer argued that ignoring everyone and making your weird record regardless is more punk than half the actual punk entries on this list. Wayne isn't a guitarist, but the spirit, that's rock and roll. And that's a wrap on the 10 worst guitarists in rock history? Or are they? Because the more you dig into any of these stories, the harder it gets to actually call them bad. Terrible technique, brilliant results, wrong notes, right feelings. Maybe that's the whole point of rock and roll to begin with. Who did I get completely wrong? Drop it in the comments. I genuinely read every single one. And if this kind of guitar nerd argument is your thing, hit subscribe, and let's keep this going.
Bye.